9/11 attack is the most shocking attack on the American system and culture.
All that goes through your head is that you just can't believe what you're seeing. You know, like you just can't believe it.
Well, the attacks on 9/11 were an attack on every American.
9/11 also created greater changes in the structure of the U.S. government than any single event since World War II.
It was huge sadness that these people unnecessarily died that day.
You don't expect to be on your morning commute to work and suddenly be in a war zone. It was just extraordinarily painful.
I wasn't tremendously surprised because for a number of years I had understood that it was almost inevitable that there would be a large-scale terrorist attack on U.S. soil.
Well, when the first one was struck, we thought it was an accident. But when the second one was struck, we knew it was no accident. You know, there was something going on. We were under attack.
The World Trade Center was a symbol of global capitalism and markets, and a lot of what were positive roles America had played in the world, and just seemed like the entire system of the United States of America was under attack.
The second one they were trying to attack was the military nerve center of the United States, and that was the Pentagon. That's where the third plane hit.
Standing there, watching as the building's burning, watching these people pour out of the Pentagon and bringing stretchers and setting up triage areas, you know, with flags, you know, and getting ready to bring out survivors. There weren't a lot of people retrieved from that building that day. A lot of people died.
From the Al-Qaeda viewpoint, you know, this was a war against the West, against a mentality, against a culture. And so civilians were basically equivalent to soldiers, and so they were attacked because the goal of terrorism is to strike terror in the hearts of the population. What better way to do that than to target innocents rather than military?
I didn't see what happened, but I saw people jumping out of the building just now. I'm trying to save my sister's all right pictures of that building.
My feelings at the time that the towers collapsed, I was in disbelief that how something so big could have come down. I was also wondering how many people were still left in the building, or how many were trapped above, how many people had perished, if any. You know, we were hoping none, but that wasn't the case. Some of them escaped the buildings by the skin of their teeth. They made it out alive. They were inside these buildings. Some were underneath it when they were coming down. You know, they made it, they just managed to escape. A lot of them were in shock. You know, how could this happen here? How could this happen in New York? When I got down here, my job description changed dramatically. Part of my job was keeping a log of the pieces of human beings that were brought out. They would GPS them, and then they would radio to me that they have another one, and they would give me the coordinates, and I would write it down in my journal and keep a running total of it. So these are things that will stay with me, that is still very vivid, very, very vivid in my mind. You know, at the end of the day, we had collected nearly 22,000 pieces of human being that were logged in, and they're still trying to identify the rest of the remains to this day. They're working on it right now, as a matter of fact, you know, every day. So now walking back on the memorial site here, some of the emotions I get, I have a lot of sorrow for all of the people that lost their lives here. 2,749 people lost their lives right here. Shovels and a pick that was used down there very early on. These were the only kinds of tools we were able to use, because there was no way to drive into the site. There was too much debris in the way. Everything had to be carried in by hand, all the tools, and most everything we were using was like this. There was no power of any kind down there very early on. Of all of the first responding units that here in the city, the fire department was the one that lost the most people. We lost 343 of our colleagues, and a number of them I knew very well, and also that I worked with over the course of the years. The following day, on September 12th, we had recovered the 18th and last survivor that was down here. We found this lady in a cubby hole among the debris, and fortunately we found her by about 12:30 in the afternoon on the day of September 12th. So she was the 18th and last person. After that, it returned into a recovery rather than a rescue effort.
Once the alarm was sounded after the second tower was hit, we knew that there were other planes that had been hijacked, and so all of the staff was given an order to evacuate. And the security people were just basically saying one word over and over: evacuate. Evacuate. No matter what question you asked, evacuate. And then after the third time, they sort of pushed you along, and people just got out of the building. These security forces were heavily armed. We could have an immediate sense that there was an emergency. Once we got out of the building, though, there was a lot less clarity about where people should go.
I was one of 5 that returned to the White House later in the afternoon in order to prepare for the president's arrival back at the White House to address the nation from the Oval Office later that evening. But the initial response was to evacuate the White House. The Vice President went to the bunker, and we assessed exactly what was going on and then how best to respond.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
Well, after the attack, the White House changed dramatically because America was at war with an enemy, a known enemy, that swore to destroy our country. So a war council meeting was established. I was in charge of the president's schedule. The president's schedule dramatically changed. Everything that we had planned prior to 9/11 was adjusted or modified in a post-9/11 world.
Everyone watched the developments of the day before. They were shocked, they were saddened, but the president made an important decision that he was going to go back to work, and he wanted people to come back and establish that this kind of threat and this kind of an attack is not going to disrupt the functioning of the United States government at the highest levels. And so many of us came back to work the next day. After I had my morning briefing, I did go downstairs to the cafeteria and was shocked to sort of see a line waiting at the door. Once I realized what was going on, I saw that the President of the United States was standing outside the door of this very small staff cafe that was at the ground level of the executive office building. The president was taking a moment to hug, shake hands, and speak briefly with any member of staff that passed by. So waited in the line and did have a moment to speak briefly with him. You could see in his eyes that they were bloodshot. He had been stressed. He'd probably not slept very much or very well the night before, but he was very focused on helping reassure us, but also giving us an opportunity to reassure him.
My nephew was killed on 9/11. He was a first responder in the South Tower of the World Trade Center in New York, and he was killed saving people. And I didn't tell the president right away. I told our chief of staff, Andy Card, that my nephew had been missing. I told him this on the next day, on 9/12. And Andy Card, our chief of staff, said, "Did you tell the president?" I said, "No." I said, because the president had so much on his mind. So the next call I get is from the president. And he said, why didn't you tell me your nephew was missing? And he said, we're going to pray for his safe return. And he said, we're going to find the people who did this and bring them to justice. And 2 minutes later, the president was at my desk. And he said, tell your family we're going to find the people who did this and bring it to justice. So he reacted as a person, he reacted as a president. But I saw behind the scenes of what was happening and reaction of individuals, reacting as government officials. And I was never more proud of our government because they were focused on protecting our country.
I knew right away that my son was there because he had told me back in May at his wife's bridal shower when we were driving there that if anything happened to the World Trade Center again, that he would be one of the first ones to respond. This picture of my son, Tommy Juergens, he was a senior court officer in the state court system in New York, which was downtown Manhattan, close in proximity to the World Trade Center. I called my brother Brad because he worked at the White House, and everyone said, oh, he's not there. But being I had that conversation with him, I knew in my heart he was there. So I started calling family members up. I called my son up, and no one was answering, obviously, because he was getting supplies ready. So he was starting the rescue with other volunteers from the courts. So everybody kept like, oh, he's not down there, he's not down there. But I knew he was in my heart, because that's the type of person he was. To always help people. He was one of the last remains that they found. They never found his body, but they found his gun and his shield, his badge.
It must be remembered that actually several days before the 9/11 attacks, the CIA did provide a briefing to the president that indicated that the NSA, which gathers mostly electronic intelligence, the National Security Agency, and the CIA had indications in various parts of the world, an increase in chatter. What that means is there was an increase in signals intelligence, communications maybe between known bad guys, which indicated that something was up, that something was going to happen based on the fact that the, quote, radio traffic had increased greatly. And so this was briefed to the president, but of course, we had no information that there was anything specifically planned against a United States city. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the intelligence may have even mentioned that there was indications that there would be an Al-Qaeda attack on U.S. soil. Why, after spending billions of dollars, was the U.S. intelligence community caught flat-footed by this attack? In the 1970s, the CIA had been found in some congressional hearings of being guilty of participating in intel collection within the United States, which it is prevented by law from doing. And Congress, in finding this, enacted rules and regulations which created a wall, a barrier between the FBI and the CIA, which prevented them from closely cooperating. And the goal partly was to keep the CIA out of domestic intelligence gathering, which it had no business doing. And that is something that the FBI is concerned about. There was no ability for the entire intelligence community to put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together and create some kind of actionable intelligence, the kind of intelligence that could prevent an attack.
So as I'm driving through here, and I go through here, it's right after I pass all these overpasses that suddenly I had rolled down my window like this, and I heard the noise of a plane. I had my arm out, and I looked up, and that's when I saw it gracefully bank. And then imagine just your field of vision. It just dives in front of you. And that's exactly what happened. It was like slow motion. And it came down and it hit very low into the Pentagon, right over here, right where you're pointed. And huge fireball, explosion, and just absolute bedlam after that as people tried to get out. And of course, I pulled over to the side so that I could go cover the story. can't describe the noise of the metal and hitting that. Basically, the Pentagon is nothing more than a huge wall. It's a fortress. And seeing the wings fold back and just that noise, it was just excruciating. And you know that no one's going to survive that on that plane. And you know the people inside that building are going to die. And you're helpless. There were so many heroes on that day. My own personal hero is a guy who came and asked me if I'd help the FBI with their investigation, if I'd be willing to talk to them. And I remember saying, you know, of course I'd be willing to talk to him. And then, of course, that's not what came out. I maybe got one or two words out and I started sobbing. And here's a guy in full uniform, very strong individual. And I was embarrassed, you know. I'm a grown man sobbing in front of this guy. But he was so kind and so understanding and threw his arms around me and hugged me and said, you know, it's okay. You've gone through a lot. You're in a state of shock. It's perfectly normal. Your reaction is perfectly normal.
The effects on American society were profound, and that's what provoked or caused things such as the Patriot Act to be enacted, as there became very far and sweeping changes, not only in American society, but in the U.S. military, in U.S. law enforcement, and U.S. intelligence.
I think this country has changed in a number of ways. Security in this country, number one, has increased dramatically. Again, getting on a plane, whether it's national or international, on a cruise ship, wherever you're going, you're checked very thoroughly. You're restricted from bringing certain things on a plane with you, and a lot of that has not changed. It's still very strict.
Well, I don't think Americans individually or collectively have any animosity against the Arab people. Our anger in our direction is to eradicate terrorists and terrorism, wherever it is. But as far as the Arab people are concerned, the Arab people are great people, and they live in many, many nations, as we know. Our anger was directed specifically against those who sought to do us damage or who actually have damaged us.
And so there was a very clear desire by the president to make clear that Al-Qaeda and these radical elements didn't represent all of Islam. But there was also the very real need to make sure that we had clear messaging and cooperation from faith and government leaders around the world to reinforce that message. The bad actors of the world that were killing innocent people, they were trying to cloak what they were doing in the trappings of religion and justify what they were doing by way of religious doctrine and declarations of their own. Those are things that governments are never good at trying to respond to, but the Bush administration made its best effort to try to work with allies and partners around the world to communicate as effectively as possible in that regard.
That's the greatness of free speech. People in America have a right to be wrong, and many people were wrong in their speech, but they don't represent the vast majority of Americans who believe that the Arab people and those of the Islamic faith are good and decent people. The attacks on 9/11 dramatically changed America's foreign policy because our focus was much different. Our focus was in response to the attacks on 9/11 and also to make sure that our friends and allies were equally protected.
The losses of the families, I think, is what perpetrated the Bush administration to commence its war on, the quote, war on terrorism, unquote, which was a reasonable response to what had happened. But, you know, it was traced to Al-Qaeda activity with the support of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And not long after the 9/11 attacks, some operations in Afghanistan began.
Well, Afghanistan proved to be a very tough place for America to operate in because, you know, it's tribal, its government was not stable, it never has been stable. There were factions of the government that wanted American presence to ward off the Taliban and others that became havens for terrorists. So it was a very difficult place to be, but we had to be there because that's where our enemy was.
It was always going to be a riskier proposition to figure out what comes after those major military operations. And we got into the business of trying to work with supporting a political coalition, a new government. There were efforts to inform and encourage agencies of government to run, a new constitution to be run, a new political system to be stood up. Those were always going to be riskier and more problematic endeavors for the United States generally, but especially for something where there's a dominant role of the United States military.
At my direction, the United States launched a targeted operation against that compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
Well, I'm certainly concerned that things could spin out of control again. I think that that is not a policy reason that is justifiable anymore to keep the American military present indefinitely. And so we have to balance some degree of risk. And I think that the degree of risk that the American public is willing and able to support, and that the Congress is willing and able to support. Unfortunately, things are not going well for the citizens of Afghanistan. If we see the reconstitution of a network capable of striking the way Al-Qaeda was in the past, then options, I trust, would be brought to the president, and president would take to other allies to say, we need to strike again. But the role of the United States and the military, I think, needs to be prescribed to this deterrent and destruction role that a major military is designed to do.
What we're seeing, unfortunately, with what's happening in Afghanistan is that after 20 years there, the coalition national government of Afghanistan is falling rapidly. And that is obviously very unfortunate.
Sadly, I don't think the people of Afghanistan have experienced a happy and normal political and security existence for most of the last half century. I feel sad about that, but the United States military can't remain extended indefinitely in that kind of mission.
War in Afghanistan was never meant to be a multi-generational undertaking. We were attacked. We went to war with clear goals. We achieved those objectives. Bin Laden is dead, and Al-Qaeda is degraded in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's time to end the forever war.
The invasion of Iraq, however, caused rumblings throughout the Middle East that resulted in the old unintended consequences of the U.S. invasion that certainly U.S. planners had not properly anticipated. And I think the most important one is the role of Iran with Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. Certainly Iran initially was terrified at the U.S. invasion of Iraq because they thought that they were next. But then as they saw that the United States had no intention of, and in fact was wary of intimidating Iran, Iran saw an opportunity to undermine Iraq, and very much did so. Arms exports, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Americans by Iranian weapons. And no appropriate action was taken against Iran for this, which resulted in more abuse on the part of Iran within Iraq.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
But what I think, unfortunately, it also shows is that the quote idea of the Bush doctrine, quote unquote, the idea that invading a nation, you can force or foist democracy on them. You can create a Jeffersonian democracy by getting rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq is a fool's errand. That such a vision, which American policy had at the time, was not founded in any knowledge, real knowledge of the Middle East, its culture, or its people. And that such a thing should not have been attempted. To try to reform Iraq and make it into a democracy, a republic, much as the United States, was maybe not the path to go. Now Iraq has a republic of sorts, and it's trying to function, but it's under great pressure, mostly from Iran. And now we move to Afghanistan, and we see a far worse result. And the fact is that the United States was mistaken, because after 20 years there, after hundreds of billions of dollars spent, after the deaths of 5,000 U.S. troops, untold number of Afghanis, untold number of Afghani military, and 1,000 NATO deaths, that the country is falling apart as if it were 2003. And that all of our efforts there seem to have been for naught. And I guess that's because we didn't pursue the policy the way we should have. Now there's some who say, oh, well, we didn't do the right things there. We were right in going there, but we didn't do the right things there. I'm not so sure about that. And I think a lot of the American people would share my view that I don't know if it was just a matter of, well, what exactly did we do there? Would that really have made a difference, or was the idea of any foreign intervention in Afghanistan doomed to fail?
I think we just have this perception as Americans that, this is how we're seen in the world, but I don't think we're listening to what the world has to say back to us. And I think our foreign policy has implication. It's terrible what happened on that day. It's awful. But I think Americans have to have a better understanding of what's going on in the world and how we're perceived. Another thing that's really sad about that day is, 9/11, you see what happened, and I think Americans came together. You saw Democrats and Republicans outside Congress, singing together. There weren't Republicans or Democrats on 9/11. There weren't Muslims and Jews and Christians on 9/11. There were Americans. Everybody came together. It brought everybody together. But 20 years later, is there a concern that there's terrorists outside our borders who may attack us? I think that's still a possibility. But now there's domestic terrorists. I mean, now there's people, maybe not in planes, but they're attacking the Capitol. And that's what's happened in 20 years.
Well, we should never forget the evil that humans are capable of, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's 9/11. Whenever evil rises, it's up to good to overcome it. And I'm confident that good always overcomes evil.
And we don't just have to worry about terrorism from outside our borders, we have to worry about terrorism inside our borders, extremists inside our borders. And so to me, when you talk about weapons on that day, those planes were turned into weapons. But what fueled those planes? It was words, Osama bin Laden's words, and it was these advocates of him. Well, what fueled what happened on January 6th? It was words, And suddenly you have people in our own country who are willing to attack the Capitol.